I never imagined that the sentence that would fracture my life would be spoken so casually, so publicly, and with such finality. Please stop touching my kids in front of their father. The room went quiet. Not the respectful kind. The kind that swallows you whole. We were standing in the driveway, sunlight bouncing off the windshield of a car I'd paid for. Backpacks I'd bought slung over shoulders I'd helped carry for years. Her ex stood there, clean-cut, confident, expensive watch glinting like a badge of resurrection. He had been gone for most of their childhood. Now he was back, successful, smiling, suddenly important. And I was being corrected. Not privately, not gently, publicly, like a liability. I froze, my hand still hovering in the air where it had been moments before. An instinctive gesture, the same one I'd used for years to guide a child across the street, to offer reassurance, to remind them they weren't alone. I felt heat crawl up my neck. Confusion first, then something colder. I met my wife when her daughters were 7 and 9. Their biological father was a ghost. No calls, no visits, no birthday cards. Just an occasional name mentioned like a cautionary tale. I didn't step in because I wanted credit. I stepped in because someone had to. I paid school fees without being asked. I attended parent meetings alone when my wife worked late. I learned spelling words, math shortcuts, and which teachers preferred emails versus phone calls. I drove them to dance practice, soccer games, birthday parties. I sat through school plays, clapping until my hands hurt, scanning the audience every time to see if their father would show up. He never did. When one of them cried at night, I was the one pacing the hallway. When permission slips were due, I signed them. When money was tight, I skipped things I wanted so they could have what they needed. I told myself that family wasn't about blood, it was about consistency. For 5 years, I was consistent. Then one day, he reappeared. Not apologetic, not remorseful, just successful. New job, new car, new confidence. The kids were thrilled, and I didn't resent that. They deserved their father. I stepped back emotionally to make room. Or at least, I tried to. But something shifted in my wife. She became softer with him, more accommodating, more willing to rewrite history. Suddenly, his absence was explained away as him finding himself. Suddenly, my role was no longer foundational, it was optional. That sentence in the driveway wasn't about boundaries. It was about optics, about appearances, about making him comfortable at my expense. So I did exactly what she asked. I stopped touching her kids. And I mean everything that came with it. No more homework help. No more rides. No more payments for activities. No more weekend outings. No more stepping in when things fell apart. If their father was present, emotionally or physically, then I removed myself entirely. Even when he wasn't around, I stayed consistent. Boundaries go both ways. At first, my wife thought it was temporary. A mood. A silent protest. It wasn't. Weeks turned into months. Bills piled up where my contributions once filled the gaps. The father made excuses. Work was busy. Money was tight. He promised to help soon. He never did. That's when the argument started. She accused me of being petty, of punishing the kids, of abandoning responsibilities I'd willingly taken on. I reminded her, calmly, that responsibilities don't disappear when respect does. That you don't get to erase someone's role publicly and still demand their labor privately. Our marriage began to rock quietly. No shouting, just distance. Silence at dinner. Separate routines. Parallel lives under one roof. Eventually, she suggested therapy. I agreed, not because I thought it would save us, but because I wanted a witness. The therapist listened carefully, asked questions, took notes, and then said something my wife wasn't prepared to hear. If you are allowed to set boundaries to protect your children and your co-parenting dynamic, she said, then he is equally allowed to set boundaries to protect his peace. My wife stared at her like she'd been betrayed twice. That was the moment I stopped feeling guilty. We stayed together, technically, but the marriage we had before died in that room. I help now when I choose to, when I have the capacity, when it feels voluntary, not expected. The obligation is gone. The illusion is gone. And with the space I reclaimed, I finally did something just for me. I bought the project car I'd dreamed about for years. A Ford Mustang. Old, rough around the edges, but honest. Every bolt I turned felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd given away too freely. Every hour in the garage was quieter than therapy and more honest than any apology I never received. I didn't get revenge by destroying anyone. I got it by refusing to disappear quietly. And I was just getting started. The Mustang changed me in ways I didn't expect. Not because of the engine or the sound, though that helped, but because it gave me something the marriage had quietly stripped away: ownership. Every night I spent in the garage was a night I wasn't apologizing for existing. Grease under my fingernails felt more honest than the forced smiles at the dinner table. My wife noticed the shift immediately. "You're never around anymore," she said one evening, standing in the doorway while I cleaned my hands with a rag. "I'm around," I replied. "I'm just not on standby." She didn't like that answer. What she really meant was that the cracks were showing. The father she'd welcomed back into the picture had no intention of becoming the man she'd hoped he would be. He loved the title, the photos, the occasional weekend visit that earned him praise. But responsibility? That stayed firmly on her shoulders. And she expected it to fall back onto mine. The first real test came with school fees. She slid the envelope across the table one night, casual, almost absent-minded. "They're due next week." I looked at it, then at her. "Have you spoken to their father?" Her jaw tightened. "You know how he is." "Yes," I said. "I do." Silence stretched between us. "I'm not paying," I added, not coldly, not angrily, just factually. She stared at me like I'd slapped her. "You can't just turn it off," she said. "You've been there their whole lives." "I was there when I was allowed to be," I replied. "I'm not now." That was the night she accused me of changing. She wasn't wrong. I had changed, from someone who gave without limits into someone who understood the cost of being taken for granted. The daughters noticed too. Not right away. Kids adapt faster than adults. But over time, questions surfaced. Why didn't I drive them anymore? Why didn't I come to events? Why did I stay in the garage so much? I didn't poison them against their mother or their father. I didn't explain adult politics. I simply told the truth, gently. "Everyone has a role," I said. "And mine is different now." They accepted it the way kids do, confused, but resilient. My wife didn't. She oscillated between guilt and resentment. Some days she apologized. Other days she lashed out. She wanted the old arrangement without restoring the respect that came with it. Therapy became less about healing and more about negotiation. And slowly, painfully, the truth surfaced. She hadn't defended her kids in that driveway. She'd defended her image. The therapist helped uncover it piece by piece. My wife admitted she'd felt embarrassed, afraid of how it looked to her ex, afraid of appearing too dependent on another man. She wanted to prove she had options, that she wasn't tied to me out of necessity. She got what she wanted. I stopped being necessary. But when the father failed to step up, financially, emotionally, consistently, she panicked. Because independence is empowering only when it's real. When someone else isn't silently carrying the weight. By then, I was done carrying it. The real turning point came when she asked me, told me, to sell the Mustang. "We need the money," she said. "The girls' activities are expensive, and their father still hasn't sent anything." I laughed, not out of cruelty, out of disbelief. "You want me to sell the first thing I've done for myself in years," I said slowly. "To cover costs their father refuses to take on, after you told me to step back?" Her silence was answer enough. That night, something in me settled. Not anger. Clarity. I wasn't the villain in this story. I was the convenient solution everyone expected to absorb the consequences of other people's choices. I refused. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. I simply said no. From that moment on, the marriage existed in name only. We lived politely, cordially, like roommates who'd exhausted their shared history. Therapy tapered off. Conversations became logistical. The future was never discussed. And in that space, I rebuilt. I focused on my work. I took on projects I'd previously declined. I stopped rushing home to fix problems that weren't mine to solve. My confidence returned, not loudly, but steadily. Ironically, that's when people started treating me differently. My wife noticed. So did her ex. When he finally realized the safety net was gone, he tried to reinsert himself, not as a father, but as a negotiator. He suggested compromises, shared expenses, vague promises. Too late. I'd already learned the most important lesson of my life. You don't need revenge when boundaries do the work for you. And the consequences were only beginning to unfold. The consequences didn't arrive loudly. They crept in quietly, like a leak behind the walls, unnoticed at first, then impossible to ignore. It started with the father missing a school meeting, then a payment, then an entire month. My wife tried to pretend it was temporary. She covered for him, filled in excuses the way she always had, for everyone. But now there was no one left to absorb the fallout. No extra wallet, no invisible chauffeur, no emotional shock absorber. Just her. The girls began asking harder questions. Why didn't Dad come? Why didn't Dad pay? Why was Mom always stressed? And then the hardest one, asked one evening while I was in the garage adjusting the Mustang's carburetor. Why don't you help anymore? I wiped my hands slowly, bought myself time. When I answered, my voice was calm. I help when I'm asked with respect, I said. And when it's fair. They didn't argue. Kids don't always need explanations. They need consistency. And for the first time in years, I was consistent with myself. My wife, on the other hand, unraveled. She oscillated between anger and regret. One day she accused me of being selfish. The next she apologized for how she'd handled things with her ex. She tried to rewrite the past, soften that moment in the driveway, claim it had been misunderstood. But some sentences can't be unheard. Stop touching my kids. Those words had redrawn the map of our marriage. No amount of therapy could erase them. The therapist noticed too. One session, after my wife complained that she felt abandoned, the therapist turned to her and asked quietly, "What support did you remove before he stepped back?" My wife froze. That was the first time she cried in therapy. Not because she'd lost me, but because she finally saw the chain reaction. She'd wanted control without responsibility, authority without accountability. And when the fantasy collapsed, she looked for someone to blame. It wasn't me. Around that time, the father made a critical mistake. He tried to assert authority. He showed up unannounced one weekend, loud, performative, full of opinions about rules he didn't enforce and expenses he didn't pay. He criticized the girls, questioned my presence, claimed space he hadn't earned. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply said, "If you want authority, you start with responsibility." He scoffed. And then my wife did something unexpected. She didn't defend him. She didn't defend me either. She just looked tired. That's when I knew the marriage wasn't ending in a dramatic explosion. It was ending in erosion. Piece by piece. The girls grew closer to each other and more distant from both parents. The father faded again, this time without ceremony. My wife tried to pull me back into the role I'd once played, but now it came with qualifiers. When it's convenient. When it makes sense. When you're comfortable. I was comfortable already. Comfortable not being needed for the wrong reasons. The Mustang became my sanctuary. Not an escape, an anchor. Every upgrade I made was intentional. Measured. Earned. Just like the boundaries I'd built. Then came the final confrontation. One night, my wife sat across from me at the kitchen table, hands folded like she was about to negotiate a truce. "I didn't think you'd really step away," she said. "I thought you'd cool off." "I didn't step away," I replied. "You pushed me out. I just didn't fight the fall." She asked then, quietly, if we were still a family. I thought about it for a long time before answering. "We're a household," I said. "Not a partnership." She nodded. No tears. Just acceptance. We didn't divorce. Not yet. We didn't explode or implode. We recalibrated into something smaller, quieter, more honest. I helped when I chose to. I contributed when it aligned with my values, not guilt. And the resentment? It evaporated. Because resentment thrives where boundaries don't exist. The irony was brutal. The moment I stopped trying to be everything, I finally became myself again. The girls grew up knowing exactly where I stood. The father drifted into irrelevance. My wife learned, too late, that love isn't proven by how much someone is willing to sacrifice, but by how carefully you protect what they give. And me? I drove the Mustang on Sunday mornings, windows down, engine humming like a reminder. Some families aren't lost. They're revealed. And sometimes the quietest revenge isn't destruction, it's withdrawal. The exposure didn't happen in a courtroom or a shouting match. It happened in plain daylight, where denial couldn't hide. It was the school fundraiser. The kind of event everyone attends to be seen. Parents, teachers, donors, a few local sponsors. My wife insisted we go together. "For the girls," she said. I agreed, not out of obligation, but because I was done avoiding spaces that once belonged to me. Her ex was there too. New jacket. New smile. The posture of a man who wanted credit without contribution. He made the rounds telling anyone who would listen how proud he was of his daughters, how hard he'd worked to get back on his feet. He shook hands, took photos, accepted praise like tips at a bar. Then the organizer stepped up to the microphone. She began thanking donors by name. I didn't expect what came next. She thanked me, specifically, for sponsoring 2 activity programs, for quietly covering fees when funding fell short, for stepping in when it mattered. The room turned, not dramatically, subtly, heads tilted, eyes narrowed. A few people looked at the father, then back at me. The organizer kept talking, reading from a list I hadn't asked to be on. My wife stiffened beside me. The father's smile faltered. That was the moment. No accusations. No confrontation. Just truth spoken into a room that had assumed the wrong narrative. Afterward, the questions came. Not to me. I didn't invite them, but to my wife. To him. The gaps in his story became visible. The math didn't add up. People are generous with praise until evidence interrupts them. The father left early. Outside, in the parking lot, he tried to salvage dignity with volume. "You didn't have to do that," he snapped at me. "I didn't do anything," I replied. I didn't even know they'd mention it. My wife stood between us, silent. He turned to her. "You let this happen?" She looked at him, then at me. And for the first time in years, she didn't soften reality. He didn't let anything happen, she said. He just stopped covering for you. That was the exposure. Not public humiliation, but the removal of camouflage. The fallout came fast after that. The father's promises were scrutinized. His missed payments documented. His excuses stopped working. He wasn't arrested. He wasn't dragged through court. He was something worse to a man like him. Irrelevant. My wife, meanwhile, spiraled inward. She started seeing her choices not as isolated moments, but as a pattern. How often she'd prioritized appearances. How easily she'd shifted loyalty when circumstances changed. How she'd assumed my presence was permanent, unconditional, immune to disrespect. One night, weeks later, she asked the question she'd been avoiding. If I hadn't said that, in the driveway, would things be different? I didn't answer immediately. Yes, I said finally. But not because of the words. Because of what they revealed. She cried then. Quietly. No theatrics. No bargaining. Regret has a sound when it arrives honestly. We didn't reconcile. Not in the way movies pretend people do. We didn't fall back into love or rediscover passion. We did something rarer. We told the truth. She admitted she'd wanted the security I provided without the discomfort of fully choosing me. She admitted she'd hoped I'd bend, as I always had, because bending had been my language of love. I admitted I'd taught her that expectation by never saying no sooner. That was the confrontation, not with each other, but with ourselves. The practical changes followed. Separate finances. Clear boundaries. Written agreements about responsibilities. The girl's father was required, formally this time, to contribute. When he didn't, consequences followed that had nothing to do with me. I was no longer the buffer. The girls adjusted. Slowly. They learned that love doesn't always look like constant availability. Sometimes it looks like honesty, even when it disappoints. They began to respect my time, my space, my yes and my no. That mattered more than being liked. As for my wife, she changed too. Not dramatically, not overnight, but she stopped assuming. Stopped delegating emotional labor she hadn't earned the right to outsource. The marriage didn't end in court. It ended as an expectation. And from that ending, something steadier emerged. Not romance, but mutual recognition. I wasn't the villain she'd cast when things became inconvenient. I wasn't the hero she'd relied on when things fell apart. I was just a man who learned the cost of silence and decided never to pay it again. The Mustang still sat in the garage, polished now, complete. I drove it less, not because I had to escape, but because I didn't. Peace doesn't demand movement. It demands alignment. And alignment, once found, doesn't ask permission to stay. Time did what confrontation never could. It clarified. Months passed without incident. No dramatic relapses. No grand apologies. Just the slow recalibration of a household learning to function without illusion. The girls grew older. Not just in